So it's finally happened after all this time. The duel of the century, the clash between intellectual titans, our generation's Chomsky versus Foucault. I'm of course referring to the debate between Slavoj Zizek and Jordan Peterson on capitalism versus Marxism. And really, what kind of neo-Marxist meme YouTuber would I be without making a video recapping the debate? But I also want to go a bit further than that today, and I want to talk directly to some Jordan Peterson fans who may be watching who have possibly had their faith shaken in Peterson after the debate, because for anybody who hasn't seen it yet, there's a general consensus that Zizek mostly came out on top of this, mostly because of Jordan Peterson's general lack of preparation on the topic of Marxism.
How have I prepared for my debate with Zizek? What are your goals for the conversation to be productive? Well, I haven't prepared enough. But I've got tomorrow, and you can do a lot with one day.
Anyway though, as fun as a debate as it was, something that really pained me to have to sit through was Jordan Peterson's ludicrous attacks on Marxism, and it's something that Zizek didn't really tackle head on, but in fairness, I don't think it was his place to, really, because Peterson went the whole opening without really directly addressing the question of happiness under capitalism, and Zizek had his own points to get out which were well deserved too. So, to make up for that fact, I figured we'd go through some of them today to just show how ridiculous they actually are. As I mentioned earlier though, I also want to direct this to any potentially wavering Peterson fans. I want to go through this and show categorically just how unprepared Peterson was, because to anybody actually familiar with Marxism, it is staggering. So to any Peterson fans, I'd ask the generosity that you stick through that as well, because I want to talk a bit about where we can go from here. Maybe you want to know more about what Zizek has to say, maybe you want to know what his position is within the far left, and just how representative he is of these logic-hating Marxists you've heard so much about. So if any of that does apply to you, I'd ask that you stick around. So first off, what we really have to stress again is just how unprepared Peterson was for this debate. This is something that even Peterson fans themselves could admit, actually, and it's kind of funny that we all agree Peterson generally doesn't understand Marxism now, because, well, I fucking called this! Seriously though, it seemed like Peterson had gone into this expecting to argue with the same typical 18-year-old radical strawman he's probably met on campuses before. He'd just throw out the same standard points about how Marx was smart but didn't take human nature into account, and that while communism is a nice idea, it didn't work out in practice and led to billions of deaths or whatever. But Nuke, you might think, this time is different. He's prepared by reading the Communist Manifesto. Oh god. So Peterson came right out of the gate referencing the manifesto, and right away went for the infamous 10 pillars of communism. I just made a video responding to PragerU doing literally this. What is it with conservatives in this single page of a 150-year-old pamphlet most Marxists have forgotten about? The standard practice here then is to essentially reduce Marxism down to this one work of essentially shallow propaganda, set up the 10 pillars as the step-by-step guide meant to be followed by all future communists, and call it a day. You can especially tell this is what Peterson was going for, as he kept asserting that many of the points in the manifesto were simply held as self-evident truths and weren't properly deconstructed and critically analysed. See, now if you already knew that the purpose of the manifesto was just to be a piece of propaganda, this wouldn't strike you as odd. It's only because Peterson is somehow convinced that this is the be-all end-all of Marxism that he can bring up these points as supposed criticisms. I mean, come on Peterson. Don't tell me you just haven't heard of Capital or the Grundrisse or German ideology. Marx goes way deeper than the Communist Manifesto. I thought this was just common knowledge. As I explained in the PragerU video, the Communist Manifesto was written for a very context-specific time and purpose, and should not be taken as an introduction to Marxism, let alone some kind of all-encompassing text about it. The 10 pillars of communism or whatever were a set of time and country-specific suggestions by Marx that he thought might bring a country closer to socialism, not even implement socialism. These ideas then actually became challenged by people such as Lenin towards the start of the 20th century, where he argued that these types of reformist methods may have worked when Marx was writing, almost 70 years ago at the time, but since then, capitalism had become so much more developed that the only way to attain socialism was through the violent revolution. So even 100 years ago, most leftists had all agreed that the Communist Manifesto was largely irrelevant, yet even all this time later, it still gets pushed in our faces. And maybe Jordan Peterson would have known any of this if he'd done any fucking reading more than just the manifesto, like Jesus. Now we really need to get that out of the way, but now that we have, there are lots of really small things in that opening statement which I really wanted to address, so we're going to watch through the whole thing and deal with them individually. There are some things which I've dealt with directly in my video on Peterson already, so if you catch me missing something out, it's probably because I don't want to repeat myself too much today. So I recommend you just go watch my video there.
Here's proposition number 1. History is to be viewed primarily as an economic class struggle. All right, so let's think about that for a minute. So there's accuracy in the accusation that is a eternal form of motivation for struggle, but it's an underestimation of the seriousness of the problem because it attributes it to the structure of human societies rather than the deeper reality of the existence of hierarchical structures per se, which, as they also characterize the animal kingdom to a large degree, are clearly not only human constructions. And the idea that there's hierarchical competition among human beings, there's evidence for that goes back at least to the Paleolithic times. And so that's the next problem, is that, well, this ancient problem of hierarchical structure is clearly not attributable to capitalism because it existed long in human history before capitalism existed, and then it predated human history itself. So the question then arises, why would you necessarily, at least implicitly, link the class struggle with capitalism, given that it's a far deeper problem?
Okay, so obviously the majority of this at first has just been him talking about deciding to read the Communist Manifesto, and I feel like we've probably already talked about how ridiculous of a choice that was already, but this is where this is one of the first points at which he gets into some specifics about Marxism, and it really is just baffling. So first off, he's talking about, why capitalism? Class struggle, it's always existed. We've always had hierarchy. Why is it specific to capitalism? And I don't really know what to tell him here, because it's okay. So first off, he's making that quite classic misunderstanding of Marx is talking about all hierarchy, or like class is all hierarchy or something like that. But no, it's not. Class is your relation to the means of production, usually whether you own it or don't own it. You can have hierarchies another way. You can be a captain on a boat, but that doesn't make you a capitalist. That's not a class of people, right? At least in the Marxist sense. But on top of that as well, Marx never said that class struggle was specific to capitalism. He goes at length to talk about class systems before capitalism, like in slave society or feudalism, which have existed for thousands of years. Previous class society to capitalism. So where Peterson got this idea, especially because the actual text reads, all history is the history of class struggles. So that's what, I don't know where you can get this idea that apparently it's just talking about capitalism, because it says all history. Now, really, like what this actually means here is Marx essentially defines history in this weird way to start with class struggle before, so like the majority of human existence hasn't existed with class, but for Marx that doesn't count as actual history in the way that we think of history as like events that are recorded and like the existence of civilizations and things like that. Before then it was just tribalism and like hunter-gatherer societies and things like that, pre-agriculture mostly. It's when agriculture reached a point as to which I believe Engels says when tribes could begin to actually feed their prisoners of war rather than just kill them and then keep them on as slaves. That was one of the first instances of class society evolving out of tribalism because of this surplus of value that they had. Well, not value, but resources. And so class society begins thousands and thousands of years ago then, not when capitalism started. I don't know what Peterson is getting at here, but it's a very weird claim to make. We're going to see a lot like these. So, yeah.
We're also actually always at odds with nature, and this never seems to show up in Marx, and it doesn't show up in Marxism in general. It's as if nature doesn't exist. The primary conflict, as far as I'm concerned, or a primary conflict that human beings engage in, is the struggle for life in a cruel and harsh natural world. And it's as if that doesn't exist in the Marxist domain. If human beings have a problem, it's because there's a class struggle that's essentially economic. It's like, no, human beings have problems because we come into life starving and lonesome.
The idea that humans are at odds with nature doesn't show up in Marx, I'm sorry. I don't have the quote on the top off the top of my head, but I know that Marx specifically always talks about how humans need to struggle with nature in order to reproduce themselves. This is the human struggle, and this is what class society is based off of. You know, having the resources of nature to, you know, or derived from nature at least, to sustain people's living. But like Peterson, you have to admit, right, that like today under capitalism, we do still struggle with nature through capitalism, but in a very abstracted way, right? Because everything is built from nature in some way or another. Everything revolves around having to struggle with nature to sustain ourselves and our livelihoods in some way or another. But in modern society, it's so abstracted from this typical idea of nature that we don't really think of it like that, but it still is, right? It just so happens that this struggle of nature is now mediated between people and through social interactions instead of directly having to actually fucking kill a mammoth or catch fish or whatever. But it's still the same principle that's happening. We're still trying to reproduce ourselves and have good quality of living. That's all it is. But like, again, Marx is still very explicit about this. And the reason that Peterson is saying this doesn't come up in Marx is because he hasn't read Marx.
Okay, now another problem that comes up right away is that Marx also assumes that you can think about history as a binary class struggle with clear divisions between, say, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And that's actually a problem because it's not so easy to make a firm division between who's exploiter and who's exploitee, let's say, because it's not obvious, like in the case of small shareholders, let's say, whether or not they happen to be part of the oppressed or part of the oppressor.
Oh, Marx considers things to be a binary class struggle. Holy, that is a take. That is a take. Okay, right. No, he doesn't. He just doesn't. I don't know how else to say it. So like, capitalism, even capitalism doesn't consider it to be. I mean, he kind of does, but he doesn't consider it to be like two classes, right? So like, there's the struggle between those who have and those who don't. But it's only been this clear cut in capitalism when there's a structured tendency for things to accumulate, which Peterson admits exists. He just doesn't consider it a problem. But even here, where we have this very strict division between those who have and those who do not, even then there are ambiguities that even Marx talks about. He talks about the petit bourgeois, who are like these small business owners essentially. He talks about the lumpen proletariat, who are like, you know, homeless people or criminals or like organized crime or one of them. I always forget what that definition is. No one really cares too much about it, but it exists. Okay, like, and then obviously outside of capitalism, Marx would talk at length about all the different classes and layers of classes, and in this transition from feudalism to capitalism, how all of the many different classes would interact with each other as they emerged or were, you know, taken out of history. Right? It's so blatantly dishonest. Not dishonest, it's stupid is what it is to call Marxism a binary class struggle. It's beyond belief.
It's also bad in this way, and this is a real sleight of hand that Marx pulls off, is you have a binary class division, proletariat and bourgeoisie, and you have an implicit idea that all of the good is on the side of the proletariat and all of the evil is on the side of the bourgeoisie. And that's classic group identity thinking. You know, it's one of the reasons I don't like identity politics, is because once you divide people into groups and pit them against one another, it's very easy to assume that all the evil in the world can be attributed to one group, the hypothetical oppressors, and all the good to the other.
Okay, this is what got me the most, honestly, right? Like, setting up Marx as a fight between good and evil, capitalists and workers being good and evil. Stalin may have done that in some kind of like grotesque attempt at propaganda, but actual Marxist theories, no. Marx was a scientific analysis of capitalism. The morals did not come into it. In fact, Marx would talk about how the bourgeois suffer under capitalism as well, in very, very different ways as how the workers do, but nonetheless they're still alienated in their own right. Okay, what Marx thought, like the true enemy for Marx wasn't the bourgeois. He just considered those as a group of people who are acting in their own rational self-interest, right? For him, it was the amorphous, faceless blob of capital, this social construct that kind of rules over us like a dictator, that the bourgeois are really just the foot soldiers of. All they do is carry out the will of capital. Okay, they're not the perpetrators of everything bad in our society, it really is capital, essentially, because the Marx is a systemic analysis, and it's not an analysis of these people are bad, we need to get rid of them. That's fascism. Like, literally, that's just what that is. So when it gets to the point, we can't say a social construct is good or evil, can we? Because that doesn't make sense. But that's what Marx is talking about. He's not. So again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but like it's just wrong. It's not found in Marx. This is not what Marxism is. It's just so blatantly. It's completely baseless. Like there isn't even a grain of truth in any of this, to the point where I have no idea where he's getting it from. He's like wildly inferring off of the one propaganda pamphlet he's read. It's just, how is this a person that's taken seriously?
If you're running a business and it's a successful business, first of all, you're a bloody fool to exploit your workers, because even if you're greedy as sin, because you're not going to extract the maximum amount of labor out of them by doing that.
So here, Peterson just doesn't actually seem to understand what exploitation in Marxist terms actually is, because he says, oh yeah, why would you want to exploit your workers? You're not going to get the most profit out of them by doing that. But like, by definition, Peterson, getting profit from your workers is exploitation by Marxist standards, right? And it's because, okay, so some basic Marxist economics, if you ignore supply and demand, you assume like a perfect market and everything is sold at equilibrium, then things are basically sold at their cost of production, right? The amount of money it takes to produce something is what it's sold at, okay? And it's only so then how do capitalists, where does profit come from in that, right? Where profit comes from is by workers being paid less than the actual cost of production. You get a surplus. So let me give you an example, right? So like, if a worker's working 12 hours a day, right? A worker's been paid a wage, and then also a capitalist has had to buy raw materials and machinery in order to make products, and then the worker's working with that, right? Let's say for the first 6 hours of the day, so the worker's making value throughout the whole day. He's just making like things that will be sold for the whole day. So the longer he works, the more money he's essentially making, right? So let's say for the first 6 hours, he's just paying off what he's being paid himself. So he's making enough money to pay off for his wage. He's making enough money to pay off for the wear and tear of the machinery and the use of the raw materials. But then for the next 6 hours, he's already paid everything off. He's already paid off the investment. So everything he's making after that is just surplus, right? It's already covered. It's already hit equilibrium. So everything beyond that is profit. It's surplus. So then all of this extra bit that's sold off, the worker is still doing labor on, but it's all the proceeds from it are going directly to the capitalist, right? So that's what exploitation is. That's the very, very basic premise of what exploitation actually is. So it's not whether or not a capitalist wants to exploit or just be mean or greedy. It's the very dynamic of wage labor which necessitates exploitation. And maybe you can argue about it, like, oh, it's not really exploitation because it's his machines or his private property and blah, blah, blah. I don't want to go into all that bullshit right now. It's a whole other thing. And honestly, the issue of exploitation for me personally isn't really the most pressing one of capitalism. There are way more important things. But if you're just going to misunderstand Marxism that badly, like, at least know what you're arguing. Like,
so then the next problem is the criticism of profit. It's like, well, what's wrong with profit exactly? What's the problem with profit? Well, the idea from the Marxist perspective was that profit was theft. But profit, well, can be theft because crooked people can run companies, and so sometimes profit is theft, but that certainly doesn't mean that it's always theft. What it means, in part at least, if the capitalist is adding value to the corporation, then there's some utility and some fairness in him or her extracting the value of their abstract labor, their thought, their abstract abilities, their ability to manage the company.
Oh my God. This bit, I found this bit hilarious because, like, first off, what's wrong with profit? Blah, blah, blah. We can go into that for a while. Where do you even begin? I mean, there's so much wrong. It's its whole own video, but let's just name a few off the top of my head. The profit motive often leads to detrimental consequences for society in general. it is exploitation, you know, as I was explaining, from the very way in which it's derived. It's defined as exploitation by Marx. But, you know, it's like you've got things like planned obsolescence. You've got things like, you know, imperialism is done for profit. I mean, I really want to talk about capital instead of profit, but that's a whole other thing. Again, that's a very big question. But yeah, there are things wrong with profit. But what I found hilarious was the way he just throws out there, you know, abstract labor. He's just going to throw that fucking term out there as if he understands what it means. You don't understand what abstract labor means, Peterson. Don't bullshit me, because you're using it to describe fucking administrative procedures and management and the abstract labor of the capitalist. Like, oh my God. Abstract labor, okay, is when you take away the actual qualitative, so the actual specific things that somebody is doing, say tailoring or weaving. These are different, like, physical activities, but they're still labor, and the products of these labor can still be compared. So, you know, I am literally just ripping this out of Capital, but so the products of labor. So, you know, you've got linen and coat and a coat, right? So you can say so much linen is worth so many coats. Okay, you can compare these in that way. But the actual activities required to produce both linen and a coat are very different. However, when you compare them when you compare their values, you're abstracting away all of these differences about them, and you're just looking at the actual quantitative values between them. And in that sense, you're looking at the quantitative amount of labor. And because you're abstracting away the physical differences in acting out this labor, you are treating it as abstract labor. Okay, that's all it is. I don't know where the fuck he's going with it here. He's not using it correctly. But yeah,
The next theory is that somehow the proletariat dictatorship would become magically hyper-productive. And there's actually no theory at all about how that's going to happen. And so I had to infer the theory, and the theory seems to be that once you eradicate the bourgeoisie, because they're evil, and you get rid of their private property, and you eradicate the profit motive, then all of a sudden, magically, the small percentage of the proletariat who now run the society determine how they can make their productive enterprises productive enough so they become hyper-productive. Now, and they need to become hyper-productive for the last error to be logically coherent in relationship to the Marxist theory, which is that at some point the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, will become so hyper-productive that there'll be enough material goods for everyone across all dimensions.
Okay, oh my God. Okay, right. So there's no theory at all about how hyperproductivity is going to happen. Marx just never talked about it. Obviously, that was just never brought up. I'm fairly sure it was brought up in the Communist Manifesto, but even if it wasn't, it was brought up in many other places. But hey, we'll go over it for you, Peterson, right now anyway. So the point is that when Marx is praising capitalism as this massive human achievement that's caused immeasurable wealth never before seen in human history, that's what's giving us hyperproductivity. It's capitalism, right? It's the Industrial Revolution. It's technological advancement. The only problem is, the only reason we're not enjoying this wealth for everybody today is because capitalism is incompatible with everybody having wealth. At the very foundation of markets, and wage labor especially, you can't have everybody having everything, because if markets would instantly fall apart, because supply and demand doesn't really work if there's no demand or an infinite supply. And wage labor especially, if you're not forced to go out and sell your labor in exchange for a wage to maintain your food and rent, then a lot of people won't. In fact, the peasants had to be literally forced out of their homes in the rural farmlands into the cities. This is also the origin of the police force, to then keep these peasants who have been taken away from their families and had all their tools and land stolen from them, and then forced to work in mines or factories. All of these people, they had to be forced and have their resources stolen from them in order to set up the dichotomy of a small amount of people owning most of the land and resources and the majority of people not, to allow wage labor to happen. So if everybody, so this doesn't work. In fact, this is what's so brilliantly contradictory about capitalism is the first time in history where we can have a crisis of overproduction. We can produce so much that the market can't handle it and it crashes, and it actually ends up as worse for everybody. And this is one of the main things that caused the 1930s crash, right? And it's played a part in many other crashes throughout history. It's so insane that we have so much wealth and it's a bad thing, right? This is how communism has enough resources for everybody, because we can feed everybody on the entire planet right now. That's a fact. We have enough food to do it. We can give everybody a home, right? We have a stupid ratio of homes to homeless people. But actually giving these resources out is incompatible with the profit motive and incompatible with capital. So it's not done. So as soon as you take away those social constructs, essentially, which are restricting this, and instantly, the only thing then is having society adapt to this new mode of production. As soon as it's done that, then there's no problem with sharing resources, because we have more than enough to go around. It's literally just a social construct which is preventing this. That's the theory. And this theory is like, this is very basic Marx. So how to say that there's no theory, I don't fucking know how you can say, oh, this was just never talked about. Because again, I'm fairly sure this comes up in the manifesto. I haven't read it in a while, but Peterson, come the fuck on. If you can literally think, oh yeah, Marx was a pretty smart guy, and then also think, oh yeah, Communist Manifesto was the only thing he's ever written. Does it not like trigger something in your head? Like, Marx wasn't a total idiot, but he's set up all these things and just hasn't bothered to explain them at all. And that doesn't seem weird to you, that you think those two things at once. So I think those are the main points in which Peterson very blatantly misrepresents or misunderstands Marxism. So I needed to point those out, just because that I can't help myself, you know. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. But I mean, there was obviously loads of other stuff in there that we could have talked about, but I feel like those are the main really blatantly bad points. Even by like regular conservative standards, even by Peterson standards, this was impressively bad. With that out of the way, I think we could probably talk now a bit about Zizek. You know, what did Zizek do? How did he do? I think we could have some fun there, so let's do that for a bit. So Zizek was his usual adorable self, getting incredibly embarrassed by his introduction, fucking with the moderator and leaving him lost for words.
Particular issue, stop.
Did you already do your Stalinist manipulation and censored the questions and how? Because this program that he described to us, through some screens, questions and so on, I think it puts him to the one who decides which questions are, as Stalinists would have put in, are the real voice of the people.
Yes,
and so
yes.
on.
Well, hopefully we can trust him.
Let's move on from that.
And of course, he performed really well in the debate too. I remember when this was first announced, everybody was terrified that Zizek was going to be his usual self in his talks and rant incomprehensibly about old Soviet jokes for hours, with the occasional point sprinkled in. And while he kind of did that, he still made the points he needed to make incredibly well. Of course, that being said though, there were still some issues.
Just remember the outcry against my critique of LGBT plus ideology.
Zizek, we gotta talk about wording sometime. Still, nonetheless though, I think he did a good job. Presenting himself as a quote-unquote rational Marxist, critical of political correctness and identity politics, exposing Peterson's shallow understanding, and I think best of all, striking at this idea of the cultural Marxist cabal. Ultimately though, the whole debate taken into consideration, I think there are probably a few ideas that are going to be left on the intellectually curious Peterson fans' mind. And that's firstly, what else does Zizek have to say and where can you get into him? What exactly is Zizek's position within the far left, and does he really count? And lastly, maybe for some who have been especially swayed, where can you even begin getting into leftism in general? And I'm going to do my best to try and answer all of these questions for any Peterson fans that might be watching. You might be wondering what Zizek is even about besides sniffs and Eastern European anecdotes and weird Hegelian stuff. And you can dig deep into his deep philosophical ideas, and there are some great ways to do that. But besides that, I also actually think he is a very good source for a contemporary far-left take on a lot of current issues today. Much like Peterson, Zizek has a lot of lectures online in which he talks about the refugee crisis, the current stagnation of the modern left, political correctness obviously, and LGBT issues, and so on and so on. And I'm not going to tell you that Zizek is right on the mark with everything he says. I have my disagreements with him, and a lot of leftists that do like him also have lots of disagreements with him generally, but most people do agree that he's still a very valuable source of useful perspectives on current affairs issues. For Peterson fans specifically, I think I might recommend The Pervert's Guide to Europe as a good first talk for Zizek, because he goes over things like the refugee crisis, political correctness in the context of when you need to be intolerant to intolerant cultures, and lots of other interesting points too. So I feel like that's something that might resonate a little with Peterson fans maybe. Beyond that, I think Organizing a New Power is a really good one. It summarizes Zizek's contemporary ideas on a lot of things quite nicely, and also does talk a little bit about his ideas on what the left could do for organization today, as the name suggests. It does kind of assume a more left-leaning audience, but if you just take that into account going into it, you can still get a lot of value out of it without necessarily being a leftist yourself. So in regards to Zizek's philosophical ideas then, what he's most known for is his concept of modern ideology in a post-ideological society after the end of history. The most introductory work here, if you want to just go straight for his books, is definitely The Sublime Object of Ideology. There is, however, an actual movie that Zizek has made, which is a really fun watch and really sets the fundamental ideas for Zizek's conception of ideology, called The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, and I would highly recommend giving this a watch, as it's really interesting and generally just really fun.
I'm giving you a choice. Either put on these glasses or start eating that trash can.
I already am eating from the trash can all the time. The name of this trash can is ideology.
Now, I am going to give a word of warning real quick. If you are intending to delve into Zizek proper, you should be prepared to not really understand a lot of what he's saying at first and have difficulty kind of keeping up with his points. This is because Zizek makes points in a very weird and roundabout way, and I feel like understanding Zizek is almost a skill in itself. However, luckily, it doesn't take much to actually improve. It just takes practice. You just need to keep listening to Zizek's talks, re-listen to his talks, and eventually you'll kind of get a feel for how he talks and what he means when he says certain things, and things will start to click. And trust me, it is worth it, because I feel like he does make some really good points. But just again, as a word of warning, don't be put off at first if you get into this and you feel a bit overwhelmed, because it's something that everybody goes through. But you will get over it, is what I'm trying to say. If you are really stuck on something though, I'm always open to being shot questions on Twitter. You know, I'll help you out if you need it. Secondly, what kind of Marxist even is Zizek? And this one is important because one thing that I predicted might happen during the debate is that a lot of Peterson fans might try and rationalize themselves away from having to confront the fact that maybe the left isn't so crazy and detached from rationality as they've been led to believe, and instead assert that Zizek is not a typical type of Marxist, but his own thing, detached from the social justice warrior crowd and actually open to reasonable discussion. So I hate to break it to you guys, but yes, Zizek counts as a real Marxist and holds a lot of the same ideas that typical Marxists do, and in fact has quite a large following from across the left. Zizek agreed on Peterson on a fair amount of points, and some people implied that maybe they're not as different as we all think. But here's where I really want to stress something that I was saying earlier. Yes, Zizek has his criticisms of political correctness, and we can talk about how valid they are in its own other discussion, and it's a fun discussion to have, but he is in no way okay with, say, misgendering people in the same way that Peterson is. And again, this really needs to be stressed, because I feel like there might be some Peterson fans out there who maybe they're warming up to Zizek, but they still hold a lot of issues with feminism or trans people or something like that. And they feel like maybe they can get away with keeping that, yet getting more into Zizek, because hey, Zizek is against these things as well, right? No. You see, Zizek's criticisms of identity politics and political correctness are on a much deeper level than anything that Jordan Peterson and adjacent figures give, which is essentially, in all honesty, just fear-mongering. Zizek still is fundamentally for the rights of these people in the same way that most leftists are, and you can't get away with liking Zizek but still holding these typical anti-social justice warrior views, because it doesn't actually align with what Zizek thinks. And again, maybe that's obvious, but I personally just felt like it really needed to be hammered home, because I feel like I have seen people hold these misunderstandings where they think Zizek's interpretation of political correctness and identity politics basically is the same of Peterson's, and it's really not. Something actually that you might want to read if you are a bit curious as just what is this critique of political correctness then. I might actually recommend Mark Fisher's Exiting the Vampire Castle. And this isn't by Zizek, obviously, but Mark Fisher, I feel like, is a very close thinker to Zizek, and I'm actually going to bring him up in another book anyway. It talks about call-out culture, mainly, which I feel like is pretty adjacent to a lot of the issues with political correctness that Peterson fans feel, maybe, and definitely what Zizek feels. So if you really want to understand where Zizek is coming from when he talks about political correctness and identity politics, I feel like, even if not all-encompassing, this essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle, is a great place to start, and it's still very short and accessible, so it's still a good read. So I would recommend it for that alone. And again, there might be some leftists watching now who are still opposed to even Zizek's criticisms of identity politics and political correctness, but that's fair enough. I feel like it's its own discussion that we can have another time. But I feel like we have that from within the left. We're not actually arguing we're not arguing around the rights of trans people or anything like that. There's no genuine hate involved here, is what I'm trying to say. And lastly, some of you Peterson fans may have really been brought around and might be wondering from here, how can you actually get into leftism itself then? Well, lucky for you, you've already made the first step by watching this channel. No, but seriously, I do like to think I have some pretty good introductory videos here, so maybe you want to go check them out if that's your thing. But there are also loads of other really cool YouTubers around here, like Bad Mouse for more Marxist stuff, Philosophy Tube for philosophy stuff. He actually made a video on Jordan Peterson too recently, you might want to go check out. And then of course there are the big guys like H Bomber Guy, ContraPoint, Sean. You're likely already familiar with them. What I would say actually is, if you're finding yourself in a position where you might have a more open mind than you have before, maybe go back and revisit some of their content and see how you get on this time. You never know what you might find. But anyway, for communism specifically, I would actually recommend a really good book called Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. And regular viewers of this channel are probably already well aware of this book because of how often I push it at them. But that's because it is really a good book. It gets you into a different way of thinking about modern society. It's very Zizekian. It actually quotes Zizek directly a few times, and Zizek refers to the book even today. And in general, which is very accessible, very short, so it's definitely high up there on my recommended list. Some other leftists might recommend things like The Bread Book, also known as The Conquest of Bread, but just don't, honestly. For newer leftists, I often recommend staying away from older texts like that, unless we're talking about Marx specifically, because the concepts aren't usually as interesting or as relevant to today. And for the same reason, I'd also recommend staying away from like Lenin and State and Revolution and things like that. Because a lot of these polemic works often just gear you up to getting stuck into this 20th century mindset, and then before you know it, you're kind of just stuck on Twitter on this Leninist versus anarchist debate about Kronstadt or fucking Trotsky or something, and it's a mess, man. Don't even get into it. Honestly, my best advice if you want to seriously get into leftism would just be, don't pick out an ideology, like you're scanning for a catalog or something. Just stay out of that factionalism bullshit altogether, honestly. At the same time though, don't supplement that with a general anti-sectarianism vibe, because I find that often just leaves you vulnerable to getting caught up in whatever ideology just a few months down the road anyway, just whichever one you happen to learn about more first. Just learn as much as you can and stick to Marx for the old shit. But for the love of God, don't read the fucking Communist Manifesto.